Good morning, dear students. I hope this lecture finds you well. And I hope also that you can hear me. Sofia, Violetta, hello to you. Alina, thank you very much for coming. It's a very dramatic example of what we're doing these days, because it's quite it's a very dramatic situation that is happening right now in the country. So we meet in a very tremendous changes, perhaps in the country, in the economy. Also, it reminds us that some time ago, a few years ago, not so long ago, we also went online in order to start doing some work in the internet. We had to do that just because the situation was also very serious. The pandemics started, and many people just used digital technology in order to start a new life. Since we are doing geofinance and geoeconomics, it is very important to talk about global global events that are really important and that were also tremendous and significant for the global economy, for people living in the world. Global terrorism is one of these events that constantly follows people through decades already. 21st century started with very dramatic example of terrorist attacks in the United States. It was 9/11, 2001, which completely changed the world. Also, in Russia, there was a series of terrorist attacks in late 1999 and early 2000s. The situation was also very dramatic, maybe even more dramatic than today. The whole country was suppressed by these terror. Inside them, people started fearing all these explosions in the internet, in the metro, all these explosions in residential quarters and neighborhoods. So the situation was quite terrifying. So we got to talk about things such as global terrorism even today, although maybe for some time ago it was not so acute as a problem. It was not so difficult to understand, and people started to quieten down a little bit. Actually, life was trying to normalize a little bit. Normality came as a term to use in these days of ours, in these unfortunate days in the past 20 years. Normality was also quite a difficult thing to do, quite difficult to ensure. Dear students, I have some problems with the presentation. Can you see the presentation, actually, on global terrorism? No, you cannot. Mhm. What about now? Can you see the presentation now? Can you say something, because I shared my screen and I cannot see whether you react or whether you write something. Just say that you see it or not. Now, do you see the presentation, right? Once again. Mhm. Okay, thank you very much. So let me continue. Um, the global terrorism, like I said, is a huge challenge. Of course, it's not a new challenge that we witness these days, and it was not a new challenge in the start of the century. But our life today is, of course, characterized and depicted, and it depends on the things that happened in the very near past. And it was like I said, the early 2000s. After 20, after a quarter of the century, terrorism became part of many people's lives. Some organizations developed special indices to show that terrorism can be measured, like an index of countries or a number of countries that participate some in some sort of surveys and other things. So it's a very interesting issue to do. Statistically, it's a very interesting thing to do. And the mission of these organizations, such as these, is to show, for instance, the Institute for Economics and Peace, IEP, he developed some sort of a mission for people to understand the level of risk. And also, it's important for international business and international corporations that are doing business in many countries in the world. Terrorism is a threat for businesses, it's a threat for people, it's also a threat for foreign investment, because if the country and the political situation in this country is not stable, then business would not be very eager to go to your country to do that sort of business. So the business or a transnational corporation must be sure that everything happens for a reason and there is stability, tranquility. People understand what they are doing in terms of business, in terms of commerce. They start planning in times of economic crises, in times of uncertainty, it's almost impossible to measure the risks of your business, and it's impossible to plan future profits. It's very difficult. It would be very difficult or even impossible. These institute is doing its business in cities such as Sydney, New York, Brussels, The Hague, Mexico City, Harare. I hope that you see the photos of the cities on your screen right now. Violetta, can you see the pictures of these cities? Great. So these cities of the world, of the international offices of these organizations, what are they doing? They try to collect the data from various places. They survey people in countries like Australia, the United States, Belgium, the Netherlands, Mexico, Zimbabwe. Of course, in terms of global scope, it's impossible to do these ratings only in some specific place, because you got to go to other countries. We have over 200 countries, like we understand. We have over 220 countries already, and that means in order to measure the risk of terrorism as a global threat, you got to go there as well. So these cities are just the places where they are headquartered, this Institute of Economics and Peace. And it has its own goals, of course, to understand the level of the research. They do their business, they have their own organizations. They work with organizations such as OECD, which is Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They're working with Commonwealth Secretariat. Commonwealth, maybe you know that the British Empire, after its collapse, it could not retain all its colonies, but the British created a sort of a commonwealth that encompassed former colonies in Africa, in Asia, and they're still part of these unions, so to speak. It's a forum, it's not a political organization, it's just used as a sort of a platform to discuss global threats, opportunities, cultural issues. So it's also a very important organization, as if we speak about some English-speaking countries mostly, because the British Empire led its way in the globalization in the early 20th century and later part of the 19th century. But if in those days, 100 years ago, Britain was U.S. of today, for instance, today Britain plays um, a more limited role in the global economics, in the global finance, geofinance, so to speak. Continuing doing these activities, they of course produce various indices that show some threats, most important threats and the challenges that we face today. I think you can see now on your screen, and you will tell me right away that you see those things. For instance, environmental threat is really important today. Violet, I think you would agree that global climate change is a threat to the global business environment. It's also quite understandable that we got to take into account that not only terrorism is important to analyze, but also things such as these. Aline, I think you would also agree that continuous global warming threatens people around the world, and greenhouse gas emissions must be reduced so that it's um, it's so that it could be so that people try to adapt to the situation. So it's always about these adaptation, right? Um, when we are talking about things like global terrorism and global climate change and other things, digitization, peace, war and peace, and things such as these, human development, it's always about this ability of people to adapt, to get used to these things, because you cannot eliminate these threats completely. You cannot diversify your risks so that your risks amount to 0% certainty or 100% uncertainty in particular examples and situations. So it's very important for people to get adapted to these situations. People can easily adapt, but they need some sort of leadership. So you cannot mm, just make them understand that they got to be flexible in some things. The role of the government in this particular example is try to establish a special environment for people to feel that they have this support behind their back, and that they do not have to flee somewhere to some other countries if they do not feel safe in a specific country, in specific markets. They would just flee or immigrate. Now, of course, there are some people here he cannot adapt to these situations, and they flee the countries and nations. And Russia is a very picturesque example of immigration waves through centuries. Millions, hundreds of millions of people over centuries immigrated from Russia since Ivan the Terrible, perhaps. These people were dissidents, they were some political, like today we would say, opponents. They were in opposition to the government. They criticized the government. Of course, there were not many these people, but they were trying to seek a better life like they thought. However, sometimes they did not find a better life there outside uh, this country. They found also their death there. The situation did not change completely over the centuries, so we have quite understandably the same thing even today when people are trying to adapt and other people just flee this country seeking better salaries, seeking better paid jobs, and whether maybe they are looking for careers for their future careers, or they go to study. Many people return and try to contribute to economic prosperity in this country. So let's talk about global terrorism index in detail. What is it? In 2023, this organization produced its 10th index, so that means this is not a new thing. It was created to analyze global terrorism 10 years ago, and they still use this methodology to understand what that is and try to rank countries according to some sort of methodology that says that this country or the other country is more dangerous than the others. Mm, Terrorism as terrorism is also a social problem. It's not only a political problem. Terrorism may be driven by economic um, ideas and economic purposes. For instance, when I was a student like you over 20 years ago, during our lectures, we were told, the students, that um, global terrorism emerged as a way to oppose globalization. During our initial lectures, we were very frequently talking about globalization as a phenomenon that led to prosperity in many countries. However, there were countries that were always like on the brink of collapse, or they were on the brink of poverty, and these countries were always unhappy. They could not follow other countries for their prosperity. And these countries included countries, for instance, many Arab countries in the Middle East, in North Africa, like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Somalia, and many other countries. So they were quite unhappy with what was happening in the world. They were lagging behind other countries economically, and their reaction was to organize terrorist attacks on various cities, on planes. One of the first terrorist attacks in modern history was on an airplane. Muammar Gaddafi, dictator in North Africa, he used this sort of method to try to press upon foreign governments, for example, to unlock his assets that were frozen as part of financial sanctions against Libya in the 1960s and 1970s. And after 40 years of his dictatorship in this country, he was killed, like you know, and it was there was a spread of violence in many Arab countries in early 2010s. This period was called the Arab Spring, right? Maybe you remember that this period was a sort of a spring, and many countries in the world experienced waves of orange revolutions. Uh, do you understand what I mean by Arab Spring or orange revolutions? Because these things happened quite a long time ago. It was Orange Revolution in Ukraine, for instance, happened in 2004. So it's exactly 20 years. And 20 years ago, the situation in Ukraine, our closest neighbor, began to deteriorate so dramatically that later we've seen the situation that led to the special military operation and special military operation in the Crimea in 2014. Actually, you see, it's a sort of repetitive process. Yeah, 2014 also 10 years since the start of the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and 2024 today is a sort of a height or a peak of some terrorist activities in recent history. So maybe there is some sort of logic behind what we are talking about. This index, like you see, does not encompass each and every country in the world. It has identified only 163 countries according to the real impact of terrorism. And these countries, if you see, let's look at the methodology, for instance. There are some indicators to talk about when it comes to terrorism. So, when it comes to terrorism, what do we usually take as statistical evidence of the riskiness to live in a particular country? And they developed this index according to some weights and indicators. They have just four indicators, like you see, and their weight in this index. Um, by looking, if you look at this table with indicators and weight, you would see that the most important indicator is what? What do you think is the most important indicator? Alin, I see your comments. You talk about terrorism in Arab countries. It's worth adding that such actions are partially committed due to false trends in Islam. Hmm. Yeah, they also, yeah, I did not mention that, of course, but it is true that religious issues were very important as a source of terrorism in those days. And radical Islamism, radical thinking in these countries was also behind some of the things and threats that came later on as trends, like you say. And today, they maybe in some years they um, slowed down a little bit, became calmer, but recently we see new waves of these Islamic uprising. Of course, part of the reaction comes from the fact that many Western countries try to press upon Islamic countries during the Arab Spring, for instance, or you may also add here the United States that is interfering with economic policies and political system in many countries of the world. So people do not like to be oppressed by some hegemony on part of the superpower like the United States. So they express their unwillingness and to support, to make people understand that they are doing it right. They turn to God. They turn to something sacred to many people, and the Arab world is a billion strong population. So 1 billion people live in Arab countries, and they have some values about God and about their religion. So it's quite understandable that when some politicians use Islam as a weapon, they create some incidents. So, could you please tell me what is the most important indicator when it comes to methodology measuring global terrorism situation? According to the table that you see on your screens, what is the major factor or indicator? What do you think? Alina, Natalia, do you have an idea what is the most important indicator? Mhm. Percentage of acts. What kind of acts? They have indicators such as incidents, injuries, deaths, and hostages. And they actually say that deaths is the most important indicator, because the more people die, that means the more risky it is to live in this particular country. Injuries, hostages, you see, injuries and hostages take less important position in this index, and incident is closer to deaths. So the more people die in a particular country, the worse is the situation. And statistics of deaths, of course, comes as a result of terrorism, or the events that are qualified as terrorism. If you look at the, like they say, logarithmic banding scores from 1 to 10, one of the most risky countries in the world would be Afghanistan, which is quite logical because this country was always full of terrorism organizations. Al Qaeda, the very famous terrorist organization, is reported to come from Afghanistan, and they do their activities all across the world from Afghanistan, and they have, of course, affiliates in other countries. They have friends there. They are supported. They receive money from various countries and organizations. So it's quite understandable that this process is sort of mm, pursued or done by dealing or trying to measure the most important factors behind terrorism activities. And of course, it's about deaths. 10 countries, top 10 risky countries include Iraq, also Nigeria, Syria, Pakistan, Somalia, India, Yemen, the Philippines, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Also, I would like to say that constructing some indices about something that is very difficult to measure, and terrorism is one of such things. It's quite difficult to measure, just like intellect is very difficult to measure, to understand whether people are really smart or stupid, and trying to qualify them this way by trying to put them marks or give them some scores. It's quite, it's not true sometimes. So that means you got to take into consideration the common sense behind some of these incidents and other things. It's not always terrorism. And Natalia says, for instance, of course, mm, you do not see the presentation once again. Um, mhm. But now, also, you don't see this presentation. Mhm. What about now? You see the methodology once again. Mhm. No. Now you see once again. Again, no. So sometimes you see, sometimes you don't. Sophia says that she can see it. Lilia says, all right. Well, let's continue then. Tell me each time you do not see these presentation. Okay, turning to the results of global terrorism in 2023, we got to say that there are a number of countries and the impact of terrorism on some of them is sometimes dramatic and sometimes quite not really serious. You see here the impact of terrorism can be measured also in colors. And the deep red countries, they are the most, they are the riskiest. The United States, for instance, is riskier than Russia. However, in 2024, the situation may change, yes, because of the recent situation, and maybe because there will be escalation in these activities. Maybe Russia will become a more risky country after all, after some time. Mhm. Sorry for interrupting me, Alina. What would you like to tell? All right. What about the highlights from these situation and from the terrorism activities in 2023? The report of this institute says that no improvement in terrorism after 3 years of some political activities or government policies trying to diminish, trying to minimize the impact of terrorism on their country. That means that terrorism is very difficult to solve as an issue. It is always produced as a result of some other activities. The major thing about terrorism is sources of its existence. If they have good sources that make them or help them continue doing their business, their dirty business, then it is very difficult to root out terrorism activity. In the Middle East, in African countries, it would be quite difficult to do it in any other situation. For instance, if we take Israel in October 2023, which was also a very recent, one of the largest terrorism activities in the past decades, perhaps. Maybe in the United States, maybe the situation was worse, but Israeli refugees and Israeli land operation that started after Hamas struck Israel on October the 7th. This military conflict now is a sort of a war between Hamas and Israel. And of course, people continue to die. This is not terrorism anymore. So a terrorist act turned into a military conflict or just an outright war. People of these nations kill each other in the very bloody war massacre. This is not true, of course. This is not very good. International organizations must do something about it. The organization that was really created and responsible for making peace in the world was the United Nations Organization. It was created right after the Second World War in 1945, and this organization was responsible for peace in the world. Countries who joined this organization, they signed a treaty or a convention that they would not use, will never use force, military weapons, military instruments and means to ensure that they are right in some way. So only diplomacy, only negotiations and talks between countries could decide these issues. However, from the recent history, we know and understand that this principle never worked to the full extent. Countries, even after the end of the Third World War in 1945, they continued to be enemies and foes for some countries. Like, for instance, during the Second World War, the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, France made a sort of a coalition. They were behind the coalition of peace to try to exterminate Nazism in the world. But later, when the Cold War began, the Soviet Union once again became the enemy of the capitalist world, of the advanced countries, and the rivalry that came after that led to various conflicts all across the world. Perhaps it also generated terrorism because, like we people who do not take part in terrorism activities but only feel the results of it, people on the other side of the barricades, like we used to say, they also adapted. And if during the some military operations on part of the United States or the Soviet Union, they were the victims, they also tried to adapt to constant threat that they could be killed or something by doing some rebel activities. They became sort of rebels and partisans. They escaped, they tried to hide, came later with more violence. They divided into small groups of militants, and it is very difficult to track the doings of small groups. And we witness that just these days. It's very difficult, really, to track the whereabouts of a few people. It's much easier to track the movements of armies because it's a lot of people and you can see them. But a group of professional terrorists may be masked, they can be veiled under some fake identities, and they appear as simple people, as civil people, and they do their dirty work, so to speak. So that means that terrorism survives just because, like other people adapt to terrorism, and terrorists adapt to this hunt on part of the government. So they understand that the government must eliminate them some way, in some way or by some means. And that means they got to adapt and find some techniques for survival. And they usually also survive. Al Qaeda, which was part of the target of the United States in Afghanistan and Iraq in the early 2000s after 9/11, it also survived and it still exists. It became more secretive, it became less visible, but it still exists, and maybe even someday we will get to know that partly perhaps the terrorist acts in Moscow these days, maybe these people were responsible for these terrorist attacks as well. Maybe part of it, maybe they participated in these terrorism activities. You see, also in 2023, 25 countries improved their ratings compared to 24 that deteriorated their situation in 2022, according to this index. The largest increase in deaths, like you see, happened in sub-Saharan Africa. And you may imagine this is countries like Central Republic of Africa, South Sudan. It is also Eritrea and Ethiopia. Sahel region of Africa became the epicenter or the epitome of terrorism. You see that 43% of global terrorism deaths occurred in the region and usually occur. That means not only in 2023, but previously it was also the birthplace of terrorism, today's terrorism. They survive, they try to survive there, they concentrate their forces and strike again in other countries. Deaths in these countries continue to be quite strong, although in some countries, like countries in the Middle East, continue to decline due to lack of terrorist attacks before October the 7th. So that means after October the 7th, the situation with these, of course, changed. And if there was improvement in these countries before 2023, now the situation got worse. And you got to recalculate these things. Pakistan and Islamic State, they are responsible for the fastest growing group of terrorist activities in the world. In 2022, you see this map, it shows terrorist attacks across the world, and the largest red spots, the biggest red spots here on the map were responsible for the biggest terrorist attacks in history. You can also see Moscow on this map, but it's a very small red spot. It's much smaller than in Africa or the Middle East, in Pakistan, Afghanistan, but still terrorist attacks happened in 2022 in Russia as well. New York in the United States, Venezuela, Chile, countries in Africa, Mozambique, Central Republic of Africa. Partly these activities are, like I said, supported by military operations of other countries on the territory of their enemies. They try to command these air of defense. They try to do some bad things. They try to take away resources from them. But they also get finance through other organizations, and I think this is the most serious issue about terrorism, because we do not know the sources of their finance. Maybe, of course, there are some people who guess about these resources or the countries behind them, but still it's very difficult to track, because today's finance allows people to pay for terrorism and finance terrorism without central bank system or without a SWIFT system. You just use blockchain technology and cryptocurrencies and transfer money to the accounts of terrorists. And that would again do their dirty business later on. So it's quite understandable that financing terrorism should be struggled. It should be fought with um, serious means and serious activities on part of the governments, maybe collective activities of some governments. It's very difficult to fight terrorism alone. If you do not have international support, then your efforts would be fruitless. It's just like global climate change. Global climate change, like we said, is also a global threat for human life and human being today. But if one country only observes some environmental rules and tries to decrease the amount of CO2 emissions in their country, it's absolutely worthless, because you have other countries like China, for instance, the United States, and they're responsible for the majority of all greenhouse gas emissions. Germany claims to be one of the most advanced countries in terms of green technology. They are advancing this process of decarbonization in Europe, but Germany emits only 4% of global CO2 emissions, unlike China that emits over 30, I believe. The United States is somewhere closer to that figure. So if Germany completely stops emitting CO2 emissions, it does not mean that these efforts will contribute to decarbonization in the whole world. So its activities will be completely a waste of time, it's waste of money, it's waste of human efforts. You will not be able to do that in your country as well. So there must be some collective activity. People who are doing environmental research, they are talking about green paradox, because it's really a paradox, right? Mm, Maybe you try to employ all your forces in your country, but it is nothing compared to other countries' collective damage to the environment. And the same goes for terrorism. And until there are governments and states that support terrorism, terrorism would not be defeated. It will continue to exist in these countries. They will find oases, go there, accumulate for their forces, accumulate their strength, and strike again. And the example in the Middle East in October 2023 was the precise example of that sort of activity. So Hamas organization, whether it's good or bad, um, but still it was supported by many countries in the world financially. Germany helped, France helped, other European countries helped Hamas to stand upon its feet, so to speak. Why did they do this? For instance, well, the Germans, they have this idea this vision that country, its behavior could be changed through trade. So if you deal with it commercially and let these country make profit out of some activities, it would stop being terrorist country. However, like we saw in this example, it's absolutely impossible. So they just use this money not only for education or social and medical care in Palestine, but also for equipping terrorist groups. They bought weapons for this money and they struck this country in October. And the same goes for other terrorist organizations. I don't think that the Houthis who are doing their terrorist activities in the Red Sea in Yemen, I don't think that they are doing it on their own. So they also receive help from other countries and from other states. The state, you see, in terrorism, the leading role in fighting terrorism, of course, belongs to the state, to some government. And the leading role in survival of terrorism also is taken by the government and state, because governments and states have immunity, and it is said in the Charter of the United Nations Organization that you cannot be allowed to interfere with the activities in particular countries. If you do that, it goes beyond the international law. It goes in violation of human rights and other things. But then, of course, you reasonably may ask why then the United States is interfering in each and every conflict in the world, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, other countries, Syria, or Yugoslavia, Serbia, the bombings in Belgrade in 1999. It's always they always breaking their own rules that they created in 1945. They do not stick to it. They always find some justification for their activities. So it appears that what kind of conclusion can we make out of that sort of thinking? That terrorism is absolutely indestructible. You cannot destroy it just because there are people and states, sovereign states, that support it, that give money, supply weapons to them. There are special military groups, mercenaries like Wagner Group, for instance. He are also partly they will the purpose of this organization, they provide some sort of help to governments in Africa, in Asia, to deal with the opposition, to deal with some hostilities in these countries against the military and government coup. But like we saw ourselves in June 2023 in Moscow, in late June, there was a very dramatic situation that the whole country was expecting something dangerous to come. They organized these uprising. There was a special military deployment, and almost 50,000 troops participated in these operations. So it was quite dramatic as a situation. But in June, the government of Russia was able to stabilize the situation very quickly. Today, it appears that the control is very difficult to do. Yeah, it's just like I said, it's very difficult to track small groups of terrorists. It is much easier to track whole armies, and of course, 50,000 troops are much more visible than a group of 5 terrorists. They are more manageable. They can take initiative in their hands, and they may go unnoticed. And of course, Russia just had its elections, presidential elections in March, and also in order to defeat some struggles in the Ukraine, Russian forces also use some force to destroy infrastructure. So there are many things that coincide, right? And these things produce other threats and activities in the global terrorism. Mm. Change in the score of terrorism in 2021-2022. If you look at this sort of diagram, some sub-Saharan Africa was the only region that deteriorated in 2022. It's completely red. Other countries were not quite, or I would say better. In Russia and Eurasia, the situation did not change at all. Um, in South Asia, North America, Middle East, North Africa, South America, Asia Pacific, Central America, and the Caribbean, the situation improved a little bit. So this diagram that goes into minus 0.500, 0.400, something, it shows that there is an improvement. In Europe also very small improvement, but no improvement at all in Russia and Eurasia. And that's what it says. Well, turning back to the countries most impacted by terrorism, we got to say that um, these countries actually, it's not only figures and statistics that say a lot about terrorism activities in these countries. It's also just the news that we watch, that we listen to every day, and we know that these countries are better to avoid. So if you would like to travel somewhere, do not travel to these 10 countries or other countries with high risk of taken hostage or being killed. And these countries are like Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria, Myanmar, Niger, Syria. So do not travel to these countries, do not go there. You got to understand that for travel, for business, if you want to open your business somewhere in a foreign country, then certainly these countries should be omitted. You should really keep track of the of this index that would say that it's actually very, very dangerous as a thing to do. In these countries, in these 10 countries, if we take them as a sort of countries scaled by the number of deaths from terrorism in 2022, then these 10 countries accounted for 85% of all deaths from global terrorism in 2022. And 14% of all deaths comes upon just one country, Burkina Faso. The rest of the world, 15%. That means it is the same, almost the same amount of risk to live in the rest of the world, yeah, to travel in all other countries collectively. And just one country, so Burkina Faso, is responsible for 17% of all global deaths from terrorist activities. Mali comes next, Somalia, Pakistan, Afghanistan. It is ranked, so it may come as a surprise to you because previously Afghanistan was on the first place as the most risky country to live in, the most terrorist country in the world. But here it appears that only 9% of all deaths globally happen in this country. Or Syria, which is the country of constant military operations on parts of the United States and other neighboring countries, Turkey, some other nations. You see that Syria is responsible for only 7% of all deaths. This list of countries does not include Venezuela, which witnessed a sort of wave of killings and mass destruction in this country in recent history. However, mm, this organization that builds the index of terrorism says that perhaps actually these people are killed not because of terrorism but because of other illegal activities. And these illegal activities would include um, government's willingness and readiness to fight opposition, to defeat opposition, try to eliminate this opposition so that during the next election you win the elections, perhaps. So it's not quite terrorism, but something else. The pure terrorism is shown here, right, in these countries. Iraq, also not a very risky country in terms of deaths, right? Only 3% of people die. Maybe it is cynical to talk about people's lives in figures, and I would understand the feelings of some people that it's actually cynical to talk about people in this way, because, well, it's not just the figures behind, it's something else. It's people's lives, it's the quality of life, and that means you are not sure that next day you would just wake up and go to work or to institute, to the university, some other institutions and organizations. So if you feel uncertainty, then of course it's cynical, just like when it's some of the reporters or newsmen, they come up on air and say that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if nothing had happened really. And you feel apathy, you just listen and you understand, well, 63 people died. And nothing changes because it does not really involve your particular life. It does not involve the life of your family. It's always, well, people start feeling something about these deaths and they stop being cynical about it only when they're directly involved in this situation. So that means there must be some global impact or macro impact on society. It's when each and everyone is affected, or the majority of households and families are affected by terrorist activities. Then, of course, people start thinking that must be something that the government should do something. They start to be more attentive, just like after any terrorist attack in Moscow or any other city in Russia, people first fear to go to use metro to go to work and back, to commute, to do their regular commuting. But later they adapted to this new fear, a new scare things and other terrorist activities, and they got used to it and continued using metro as a transport to commute to work and back home. And each and every situation will be solved this way. So uh, the terrorism threat does not will not be eliminated completely. It will again adapt and transform into other sorts of resistance to governments, to society, to people who are more prosperous than other people. So it's always about some differences. It's whether it's about religion or money, political power, and many other things that very nasty, so to speak. But we got to talk about them in the language of numbers and the language of indices to measure. This diagram shows that actually Burkina Faso had the largest increase in deaths between 2021 and 2022. I think in 2023 this will be changed, and country number one may become Israel and or Palestine in this example. So Middle East would be the epicenter of increases in deaths from terrorism, I believe. Maybe even if we take Russia in 2024, maybe it will become closer to countries such as Burkina Faso, Pakistan, and others in terms of terrorism, or Israel as well. Mm. Also, you see that although some countries are believed to be quite unstable, however, Afghanistan, the country of terrorists and Al Qaeda, like we said earlier, here you see that actually it's the country with the largest decrease in deaths from terrorism, almost minus 900 people less than in the previous year, in 2020, for instance. It means the situation actually is improving. But again, I say it, it's cynical to say it in figures, because again, minus 866 people does not mean that people do not die in this country from terrorism. They continue to die. And since Afghanistan is country number one in terms of global terrorist activities, it means, for instance, if 5,000 people died last year, it's 4,200 this year, but still a very large number. And it does mean that Afghanistan could be the first country by decreases in deaths from terrorism. It is statistically it's the best performer, but morally and civilly, humanly, you cannot say that this country is less terroristic or more safe than other nations on the planet. Now let's talk about some trends in terrorism. Very important trends in terrorism across the world. And some of the other statistic that is worth talking about. Well, again, in 2015, do you remember what is 2015 is famous for, and why is this slide talking about deaths from terrorism in 2015 and after that, 2015 and 15 and thereafter? What happened in 2015? Who knows? Maybe Sophia knows, or Katya knows. Alina, what do you think? What happened in 2015 that so influenced the world of terrorism, and people started feeling more scared about their lives, and the need for governments to do something? Do you hear me, dear students? Do you hear me? By Paris, you mean Paris Agreement or some terrorist attacks in Paris, Alina? Terrorist acts in Paris. Um, well, of course, they happened in Paris, but actually, 2015 was the year when the Syrian operation began, when the United States bombed Syria, and a huge wave of migrants came to Europe. Millions of migrants tried to escape this military conflict and terrorist conflict and tried to go to Germany and other countries. And the European Union experienced a huge crisis, a migration crisis. They had to find some places for these people, to house them, to give them jobs, try to educate them, try um, to to pursue with the policy of inclusion. Inclusion today is a very used word. It's a very outspoken word today. However, it says that if you've got people and you got to do something with them, you got to include them in your society. That means you educate them, give them education, train language, so that they assimilate. And if they decide to stay here, you got to teach them to respect your country, your laws, so that they become respectable, civil people and citizens of your country. So it's quite important. That's why this institute uh, takes 2015 as the basis for measuring decrease or increase in deaths from terrorism. So in 7 years after that, until the year 2022, there was a decrease um, by 38%. Some of this decrease happened due to pandemics, just because everyone was on lockdown, and there were repetitive lockdowns in various countries in the world, and some organizations registered that actually terrorists committed much less terrorist attacks. It's just because, in order to create some terrorist act, you got to have many people concentrated in one place. If they sit home, it's not really interesting to try to bomb some place. However, of course, if you strike blocks of flats, then of course many people may suffer. But it's very difficult to escape the general attention. So when nobody is allowed to get outside, and if you get outside, you will be seen right away, and you will be suspicious. You will produce suspicions on parts of the police, etc. So you got to have gatherings, social and mass entertainment activities, just like Krakow City Hall activity of yesterday. So you need 9,000 people, 10,000 people. You need whole stadiums across the world, and you got to have more people so that you put all your force and all your efforts into one of these acts. Also, why terrorist attacks are so successful, or what is the defining principle, what is the defining characteristic of a success of a terrorist act? What do you think? What also should happen so that it is successful? So you need the concentration of people, and what else? What else do you need? Sofia, Katya, are you here with us? Can you try and elaborate on it? High level of corruption. Well, if you have people in the government who are not really interested in killing terrorists, then of course you would have the spread of terrorism. That's right. Maybe there are other factors as well. Mm, Um, Partly, but corruption would be like constant, some constant phenomenon that usually sits in the blood of all governments and in all countries. We can say the same thing about the United States and other countries. They are very corrupt also. So sometimes corruption in the government, you see, if we have government that is corrupt, it is also not quite interested in supporting terrorism. Terrorism, anyway, leads to uncertainty in society, and people may themselves organize some mass reaction, and this is not really good for a corrupted government. So I think even corrupted government would be interested in eliminating terrorism. So better to control um, the activities of gangsters and terrorist groups and organized crime rather than let them do their dirty things. Just like in the 1990s in Russia, we had a very high level of corruption in the Yeltsin's times. Yeah, in his presidency, the government was really corrupted, but there were almost no terrorist acts, with the exception of Budyonovsk and some Chechen terrorist acts. They were much rare. It's only when Putin came to power and when the things really started to change. And that was the reaction on parts of some hostile nations. So, what I wanted to say is that corrupt governments like Yeltsin's government, they also wanted to control the situation and not let the situation get out of control, so that people be safe. Because if people do not feel safe, they will not vote for the corrupt government. And corrupt government, in its purpose and its philosophy, is to stay in power. Um, Maybe there are other ideas what could be a decisive factor for the success of a terrorist attacks, like yesterday, for instance. What was the most decisive thing? Um, Usually terrorist acts are most successful when people's um, people's behavior or their understanding of the threat, the level of threat and riskiness about life in a particular country, in a particular place, amounts to some sort of apathy when they do not feel the risks that they may be killed. So that means terrorist attacks are most successful when mm, lack of preparation is also the factor, Diana says. Mhm. yeah, when actually people are not prepared, yeah, when they are not prepared and when they do not expect that something is going to happen, then of course it would be successful. So mm, if you are prepared, like today, for instance, today you will be ready, you will be more attentive to what people say, to what they do in the metro, in on the bus station. You try to listen to them. mm, you try to get more attention to what is around you, what surrounds you, what kind of situation there is. Of course, yeah, guards and security also is a factor. We have all these security in our theaters and other places of mass concentration of people, so to speak, but they do not have arms and they cannot um, react in a certain way. Also, some of these people are not trained to be um, they're not trained to be anti-terrorist um, officers or anti-terrorist people, yeah, anti-terrorist security. So they just pretend to be security so that we also be calmer. We see that this is a person who wears a specific uniform and you feel like safe in school or in the university, but when it comes to the real threat, and you are not prepared and you do not have qualified people to do the security, then of course you're right, you're completely right that people are not just qualified to do that. Sometimes in the security, there are people very old to be guards. They usually retired from, sometimes they retired from the military service, or they retired from the police service. So it means they, of course, had some experience. Maybe they were professionals some 20 years ago, but today, really, it's absolutely unthinkable to have them as securities. You cannot have 60-year-old people as guards. You got to have really qualified people. Now, also, Violetta says maybe it is having the nation's attention on other problems. Also, yeah, you're prepared to, yeah, today, for example, in Russia, you are prepared to listen to more negative news about something that happens in Ukraine, but not here in Moscow, where you feel more secured and where you like more prepared to um, understand that you will be cared about on part of the governments. However, like you see, nobody can feel safe any longer, and you got to be more careful about that. And of course, economic problems, inflation, uh, insecurity, trying to seek out a job also makes you distracted, right? Distracts you from other activities and other threats in society that could be important but become less important. Mhm. So, maybe you have more questions or comments about this lecture. Actually, the reason why I decided to do that is, of course, it is planned that we talk about global terrorism um, as a topic for the subject, because really global terrorism is a defining feature of the global economy and globalization. So it's just the a coincidence that yesterday this situation happened, and today we talk about that. So it's quite understandable that we got to talk about that more and try to elaborate, try to develop a strategy to be more prepared for the situation, so that this does not happen, so that we be more attentive and more become more of a listeners rather than just observers. Yeah, you got to be listeners, you got to feel the atmosphere, what is happening around you, and other things. And of course, I think next double class we also would discuss some of the things that happened, because we usually start with discussing the news, and I'm sure that many of you would mention some of the news that is directly connected with what we are witnessing right these days, this very recent history. So if you do not have any more questions, then we may or comments, then we may finish at this point, and after some time we turn back and start something else with a new discussion. Also, I got to understand that we're all here, right? And this journal of registers and people who reacted, of course, that means you are here with me, and it's clear that you are not uninterested in what is happening, and it is really also important to understand that today's situation and digital technology helps us be closer to each other in this way, and it does not disrupt, it does not break the relation and connection between people, communication. So it means partly we're also prepared and can adapt to the situation very quickly. So only maybe some 10 or 12 hours after the terrorist attacks, we're here again, only in a different format, but we're still together. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for your attention. Please join me in a couple of minutes.